Ready. Okay, I think we are just about set. All of our panelists are on. Let's give it just one more minute for a few stragglers to join us. Okay, before we get started with our opening remarks, I just want to let everyone know from our panelists and to also our audience members, this is getting recorded. Please feel free to shoot us any comments, technical difficulties, questions that you have throughout this call into the chat function. We'll receive those and we'll respond to you promptly. And if you're ready, I think we can go ahead and start with our opening statements.
I just want to say good evening to everyone and welcome to our digital discussion, Columbus in the Crosshairs, Navigating Symbolism in Public Art. My name is Jean and I'm the Assistant Curator for the County Historical Society and I work at Sigel Museum in downtown Easton. For those of you who don't know much about the Historical Society or our museum, our goal, no matter what we're doing, is to foster a respectful and caring and inclusive community. One way that we do this is to facilitate dialogues like this. And we always end it with the hope that we will come away with a better understanding of how history impacts our daily lives. To our audience, if you have any questions or comments once we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion, you can enter them through the chat box and they're going to come directly to me. We're going to do our best to make sure that we can sort of address everybody as it comes through. But if there are too many comments or if we happen to run out of time, what we'll do is compile a list and send it to the participants and the panelists, and hopefully after we'll be able to post any sort of responses online for you. So I would like to thank first our thoughtful and distinguished panelists for their participation in this conversation. We've sort of asked you to do the impossible by representing sort of the multitude of perspectives in your communities, and we thank you for trying to do that at all. I'd also like to personally thank Kate Pitts and Andrea Smith for their never-ending support, and also the Mellon Foundation and Lafayette College for making events like this possible. Most of all, though, I want to thank my colleague and tonight's moderator, Claudia Volpe. Many weeks ago, she approached me and my organization about partnering with her to create a safe and respectful space for people to talk about what was happening around the Columbus statue. And many weeks later, here we are. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to her. Claudia.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you so much for all of those kind words. You always warm my heart. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this crucial community dialogue. In recent months, we've experienced the rising tension and polarization around a number of issues in this country, ranging from political administrations to a pandemic and a modern civil rights movement. In the midst of this, we've witnessed a national reckoning with public figures, symbols, and traditions that we've long considered inextricable from the American experience. Caught up in that momentum is Easton's Christopher Columbus statue. While its removal has been advocated for over the 2010s, we now have a petition with almost 2,000 signatures. Debates on social media, particularly through Facebook forums, have become heavily escalated on both sides of the conversation. And Jean and I, we noticed the profound lack of nuance and empathy for opposing viewpoints. That chasm, it presented us with the opportunity to develop a panel for richer discourse. Rather than framing this as a call to action or to inaction, we hope the conversation we hear today will compel us all to have a more thoughtful exchange on this topic and the topics beyond this one. So without further ado, I'd like to first welcome Dr. Andrea Smith to help situate us in the history and context behind the statue. After a brief history lesson, we'll pass the mic over to our panelists to tell you a bit more about themselves. Oh, sorry, Andrea, I think you're muted.
Yep, there we go. All right, well, thank you very much. I've been asked to start with a few words about the history of Easton's Columbus statue, and I wanted to thank the organizers for putting together such an exciting program. This is really fun. I want to start by saying that the vast majority of Columbus statues and historical markers and monuments across the country that were established before the 1930s were not the work of the federal government or state governments, but the work of private citizens. In the case of Columbus statues, often of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans. Unlike many other countries, the US had no early tradition of a centralized public history apparatus. So the Columbus statues found across the country hold many different meanings today. What I'm going to be talking about is their meanings at the time of their establishment in the case of the Easton statue, which was the xenophobic early 20th century. We often forget how strong anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiments were. Sentiments with origins at the start of the nation and which exploded in violence with riots in Philadelphia in 1844 and in Boston. The Anglo-Protestant hegemonic order felt threatened by Catholic immigrants. And anti-Catholic groups regularly claimed that people following this faith could never be full participants in a democratic system, claiming that they're more loyal to the Pope or alleging outrageous plots and inhuman acts. This sentiment was widespread and deep, and mainstream presses published derogatory cartoons in which Irish and German immigrants appeared as apes and subhuman, and stereotypes and discrimination was widespread. So the second wave of anti-Catholic sentiment that Easton statue is a part of was part of a burst of nativism that began in the latter part of the 19th century and continued until the time Easton statue was created. This is an era, of course, we know of massive immigration, and as a number of Catholic immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe grew, the same worn stereotypes are applied to these populations as well. So Catholics in America countered the xenophobia in various ways. Because Catholics often couldn't join labor unions or other private societies that were offering them health benefits and so forth, a priest created the Knights of Columbus in 1882 to meet this need. So this organization started as a private organization for Catholics that was also a mutual aid society that provided insurance benefits, like death benefits to widows and orphans if a minor was killed or something. It was also created to confront anti-Catholic hatred. And the founders chose Columbus as their hero, partly because he'd already been identified as a national hero by Protestant Americans, but also to be able to say, look, he's your hero and he was Catholic. Why do you hate us too? So why do you hate us if you love him? That kind of thing. So it was a strategic choice. The organization held these massive parades on Columbus Day. And while the organization was started by Irish Americans, Italian immigrants in the late 19th century started joining in these parades. And eventually Columbus Day became a kind of Italian immigrant celebration or holiday. So the Ku Klux Klan played a big role in Easton's marker, but not the role that you might predict. I'm going to switch over for a second, and I'm going to get right to Easton's marker. Founded in the South after the Civil War, the organization is engaging in the reign of terror against African Americans that were recently freed. The organization has a resurgence in the 20s, spreading across the country and also targeting Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. Its success in the 20s was often fanned by its anti-Catholicism. So they're again engaging in a terrorization campaign, setting off bombs at Catholic universities like the University of Dayton in the mid-1920s or Notre Dame, burning huge crosses at Catholic churches or universities or schools, even churches in Easton. They tried to block the formation of parochial schools, claiming they were part of a Catholic plot to take over the United States. They published horrible hate literature like babies being boiled alive and that sort of thing. Pennsylvania had Klan claverns all over. By the 1930s, the state's largest foreign population was from Italy, followed by Poland. And there's especially strong Klan activity where there was large numbers of Catholic immigrants, like Italian immigrants, such as Luzerne County in the mining areas, or in Easton, where Italians comprised the largest immigrant population by the 1920s. I wanted to point out Northampton County's Italian population increased from 340 people in 1890 to 4,500 by 1920, so a huge increase. The first documented Klan cross burning in Easton that I know about was in 1917 on the home of an Italian, or it was to give an anti-Italian message. Huge Klan rallies were held in Nazareth, Pennsylvania at the fairgrounds in the mid-1920s, attracting thousands of people. This wasn't unusual. At this time, 36 million Americans were part of the Klan, and 75 congressional seats were elected through Klan assistance. Okay. The Klan attacked Columbus statues as a way of isolating and alienating Catholics in general and Italian immigrants in particular. So in the mid-20s, they started a campaign to block the installation of new Columbus statues, complaining that Columbus was an alien, a foreigner, and shouldn't be depicted on American soil. They succeeded in Richmond, Virginia, when they convinced the city council to block the installation of a Columbus statue Italian Americans there had created and was going to put in the city park in 1925. One of the ugliest moments in Easton's school board history was when they heard the complaints about Easton's Italian Society, so a bunch of Italian societies, who joined together as a Columbus Monument Fund committee. And they were proposing to put the Columbus statue that they had just had made on the high school grounds. The school board, in fact, voted on September 9th to put it on the high school grounds. The newspapers announced that it was going to be unveiled on Columbus Day, October 12th, 1929. This announcement led to a huge reaction in Easton. Anti-Catholic organizations, including the Klan, the Black Knights of the Knights of Malta, the Fraternal Patriotic Americans, and the Lodge of the Odd Fellows. So these are all white supremacists, Protestant supremacists, anti-immigration, anti-Catholic private organizations, all wrote to the school board arguing against placing the statue on school property. The Klan made the most threatening kind of statement saying, Easton Klansmen and Klansmen everywhere will oppose and use any honorable method possible to prevent the placing of a monument or statue of any alien on American soil, on the soil of this country of ours. And then they went on to say, if the school board wants to put a statue on school property, why not have one of our own American citizens, Washington, Lincoln, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, Benjamin Franklin, or some other person here who has made history, okay? They concluded with a nativist cry, let's have Americans honored on our own American soil by Americans and native-born citizens and have Columbus placed at his rightful place at 9th and Washington Streets. So they're referring here to the neighborhood in Easton where most of the Italian immigrants were living. A bilingual Columbus Day celebration held by the Italian community at the City Guard Armory was packed a few weeks later and included addresses in Italian about Columbus and then a lot of discussion about the Ku Klux Klan activism. A large portion of the Italian community then attended a special school board meeting designed to discuss the question. The meeting on October 21st was so packed they had to switch venues. They read additional anti-Columbus letters, including one by the women of the Ku Klux Klan, and they displayed petitions signed by over 750 residents of Easton. The representative of the Knights of Malta said that his order protested Columbus because he never set foot on this continent and, in quotes, why deface the beauty of the grounds by placing on them a statue of an alien, in other words, a foreigner. So foreigners were not beautiful, I guess, in his view. In the end, like in Richmond, the Easton School Board agreed to the demands of the Klan and these other groups and decided to not place the statue on the high school grounds. This was a slap in the face, obviously, to Easton's Italian-American community, but a compromise was reached eventually that allowed the community to place it next to the river the next year in 1930. So to conclude, what did the Columbus statue mean to Italian-Americans in Easton in the 1930s? I believe it was an effort, you could argue it was an effort by a maligned, stereotyped, racialized immigrant group to symbolically connect to their new home. An effort to say, look, we're here, we want to take part in civic life. They didn't want to place it at a parochial school, which is interesting. Instead, they wanted to place it at the public high school. So it's a way of saying we want to integrate, we want to support the public high school in this way. We've chosen not a personal hero, but one that you have already selected. Here's our gift to the city. We've chosen to make Easton our home. That to me is kind of what the message was of this statue. I've presented a lot of detail here today, and it's depressing detail that adds yet another dimension of hatred to our national story, one that already seems to be built on exploitation, land theft, hatred, and xenophobia. This anti-Catholic history is behind the formation of many Columbus statues across the country, who are mostly established by Italian-American entrepreneurs at a time of massive anti-Italian sentiment. I guess the question for us today is, does this matter? And if so, how? So thank you. That's my little history spiel. I hope I was clear enough. And
thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Smith, for that comprehensive history. Before we go ahead and pass the baton for everyone to make their introductions, I do want to make an important reminder for our audience members and our panelists. In this country, in this community, and within our social spheres, our individual truth is multifaceted. Speaking candidly about hot button issues like this is incredibly vulnerable, and it is deserving of your respect and open minds. We ask that when you hear dissenting viewpoints, challenge yourselves to not be defensive. We all struggle with this. We all arrive to this conversation with our unique preconceptions and opinions, and our panelists will be publicly sharing their personal thoughts on a recorded conversation. So kindly keep your questions and comments respectful. With all of that being said, it is my great honor to invite our distinguished guests to introduce themselves. So in the interest of time, can you each take about 2 minutes to please share about yourselves, your professional background, and briefly any personal connection that you might have to the Columbus statue. You will have time to go into this in more detail later. So Melissa, would you like to kick us off?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and I feel just very thankful for this opportunity. My name is Melissa Meyer. I'm born and raised in Easton, Pennsylvania. It's been my home for a very long time, and I think it's a very special place, and it has a very unique place in history. And with that said, I am of Italian-American descent. I was raised Roman Catholic at St. Anthony's, confirmed. And I started the petition to remove the Columbus Monument in Easton, Pennsylvania. You can find it at change.org/racist Columbus Easton. And within a matter of a weekend, after really not publicizing it much, it garnered over 1,500 signatures. So I firmly am against this monument in Easton. I think Easton stands for so much more, and I'm looking forward to listening and learning during this panel. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Dr. Wendy Wilson-Falls, would you like to go ahead and? Sorry, Wendy, I think you're muted.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. This is very exciting, and I'm so happy to participate. I'm a social anthropologist. I also teach at Lafayette, and I'm chair of Africana Studies. And I think I come to this issue from many different places. One, because my research is about identity and ethnicity. And also because I've spent quite a bit of time out of the country where I've been able to observe other kinds of ethnic conflicts or tensions that I feel allows me to look at the ones in my own country with a little bit of remove in terms of thinking how unique they are or are not. So I don't think I'm going to say much more than that for right now.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate it. Chuck, would you like to go ahead and take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yes, Wanishi. Negashina Toke Kishkun. Ilan Lakewan Sakima. I am Chuck Gentlemoon. I'm of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. I have been chief of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania since 2004, and I've been ceremonial chief since 2012. And the years keep rolling by, as they say. I'm honored to be here. I'm humbled to be here to speak for my people. We have a cultural center in Easton, Pennsylvania. We've been welcomed there by the Segal Museum, who have a very nice display of us. The Northampton County Historical Society has helped us, and many people in the local area stop by and visit us at the Culture Center. We like to educate others on indigenous people and the first people of this land. I cannot speak personally on the Taino effect of Columbus. I can speak on colonization, and I can speak on genocide, assimilation, and some of the ordeals that have come about post-Columbus contact. We have to remember that Columbus never set foot on the mainland. He affected the Taino people very adversely when he first came to the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the other islands. I have been blessed to be instructed by some Taino people on what they would like to have say. I'm also, when I first came back to my culture as a younger man, my first teacher was a Taino Arawak woman. And so I do know quite a bit of their history and the things that have happened. So I want to thank you again for inviting me here, and I'll turn it over to somebody else now.
Thank you. We're glad to have you. Dr. Joseph Shelsa, would you like to go ahead and talk a little bit about your history?
Sure. My name is Joseph Shelsa. I am president and founder of the Italian American Museum in New York City. I hold a doctorate in sociology and education. My dissertation was in constructive pluralism. I'm also professor emeritus at Queens College of the City University of New York. In 1992, I filed a federal civil rights lawsuit for discrimination against Italian Americans at the City University of New York in hiring, promotion, and tenure. And it was granted by Constance Baker Motley in the Southern District of New York. We got a preliminary injunction. I am a member of the Columbus Heritage Coalition. I'm also a member of the Columbus Citizens Foundation, responsible for the parade that takes place every year in New York City. I'm also a member of Unico National, member of National Italian American Foundation, a member of the Order Sons of Italy in America, and a member of many, many other Italian American organizations. I want to just say that we, in the Italian American community, not only because Columbus was bringing Catholicism to America, but also because he was the first, we consider him to be the first immigrant and someone who was respected by the American people, having the first ceremony in 1792. We hold him up in high esteem, and we just feel that he is our symbol of coming to America and being proud of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shelsa. And then finally, passing it over to Julie Burrows.
Thanks so much, Claudia. I'm Julie Burrows. My background is as an urban planner, and I've worked for over 20 years in municipal cultural affairs in Chicago and in Boston. And in Boston, I actually ran a public art program where we considered many of the public monuments. And we had to, just from the perspective of running a professional public art program, while I was there, we actually had to create a policy and a process for de-accessioning, so sort of removing a piece of public art so that we could actually properly and legally remove any artwork that needed to do so. So just want to lend my perspective and expertise from running and carrying out a public art program. And I'm new to Easton. I've only been here for 2 years, so I don't have a personal connection to the Columbus Monument here in Easton, but I did want to add a personal note. And in preparation for this panel, I thought about and researched Columbus. And I surprised myself by actually discovering a personal reaction to Columbus. My heritage is of Sephardic Jewish descent, and that means that in 1492, when Isabel and Ferdinand were supporting Columbus's journey to America, they were also carrying out the Inquisition, and they were murdering and expelling my ancestors from Spain. And I surprised myself. I know that this is tangential, but it is of the time, and I feel like that context really resonated with me. And I think it just illustrates the extent to which public art can provoke very unexpected and unanticipated reactions from members of the public. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to all of your panelists once again for being here, for being vulnerable, and for being sincere and candid in all of your ideas. Just to give our audience a little bit of background, we have 2 framework questions that we'll ask our panelists. We'll ask that you all spend around 5 minutes answering those, and then we'll move into our Q&A portion. So our first question is, in approximately 5 minutes, please explain what the Columbus statue represents from your personal and professional perspective. For the sake of time, it's helpful to be specific about Easton, though of course we can also discuss the broader national and historical discourse that's involved. So following the same order that we did with our introductions, Melissa, you want to take it forward for us?
Hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'm so thankful. And just like Julie said, through researching what this monument is, its historical value through American history, I too had a very, very personal connection to this monument. As an Italian American in this community, I have been over generations in my family whitewashed. We were forced into assimilation, stripped of our language. We've changed our names. We've been institutionalized into mental institutions. And so I am today who I am because of anti-immigrant legislation, discrimination, xenophobia, and specific to Italian Americans, there's been a unique history in place within American history that has brought us to where we are today, specifically within the Black Lives Matter movement. I just want to say that hate will not be tolerated in Easton, Pennsylvania. Specifically, it's just such a beautiful city, unique city, full of artists and love and positivity. You walk down the street and there's gorgeous murals that are from people who born and raised there. And yet this Columbus statue stands and most people don't even know it's there. I grew up thinking it was George Washington overlooking the Delaware, you know? So I hate to say it, it does not make sense. And so my research and part of starting this petition was to discover why it's there and what's the reasoning and context behind it. So here we are today, and we have major cities like Los Angeles, Columbus, Baltimore, Boston, removing their Columbus statues. Philadelphia is going to be next on July 22nd. The city of Philadelphia is going to request that the Arts Commissioner of Philadelphia remove their Christopher Columbus statue. So what does this mean for smaller cities like Easton, Pennsylvania? Can we hide? Do we stand up? Apathy comes to mind. How do we use empathy to heal ourselves of generational trauma that has yet to be unpacked? We need to really show up and support each other against xenophobia, specifically in a time where our president says extremely hateful and rallies against immigrants in this country. He's calling many immigrants murderers and thieves who want to infest our country. Animals, and Italians have had the same exact language spoken against them historically. So what does this monument mean? Is it racist? It is. This is a symbol of white supremacy. And that doesn't strip the pain that Italian Americans have experienced in this country. It doesn't take away your identity and the things that your ancestors have fought for. It doesn't. But what we need to know is that Columbus has been assimilated into white culture. When we think about Columbus and Columbus holiday, no one knows what that means. We're not taught in school. It's because we have a foundation of systemic racism in our country. We're not taught that my Italian American ancestors were hugely discriminated against and had to be documented as aliens up into the early 1930s. We're not taught that the Reconstruction movement of the KKK had huge impact well into the late 1800s and 1900s. And this history, when you examine the history of the United States, when you examine the history of yourself and your grandparents or great-grandparents and where you are today and what's going on in the world, 50, 100 years, 300 years, 400 years really shrinks up. So what's going on today has a lot to do with what happened throughout the history of the United States. And we really need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to relearn and understand how we can redirect to make safer spaces for everybody, for children, ourselves, and then even our deceased loved ones. You know, I want to honor my grandmother who changed her name, who was in and out of mental institutions, who's shunned by her family. She married a white man to have white-looking babies. And what are we doing for those people? We have to do better.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
And let's move this along to Dr. Wendy Wilson-Fall, please.
Thanks. You know, I'm going to start out with saying how much I appreciate the irony of people calling themselves the Knights of Malta, but they don't want to associate with anybody from the Mediterranean. And I want to point out that this is part of a very old illness in the United States. And following up on what Andrea Smith talked about in terms of Catholicism, and then looking at what Melissa had to say, unfortunately, to just say it very directly and get to the bottom line, the supposedly Anglo-Saxon people who were here earlier built up an ideology of the evilness and the badness of darker skin, so that it was so well developed and honed to such a great degree that when Italians came over, let's face it, there was ethnic animosity towards Italians. As Melissa was saying, there was the problem of Catholicism because this earlier layer of Americans fashioned themselves, and I deliberately say fashioned themselves instead of saying that they all were, after the elite classes in England, who were Church of England, even though they themselves had very diverse origins. Everybody wasn't a plantation owner. Some people were indentured servants. But in this quest for identity, the darker, the worse, the more other people were categorized. Of course, starting out with the savage image of the Native Americans, and then the savage and childlike, uncontrolled identity of Africans. So I'm very interested in this. My own training is African studies. And when I hear somebody talking about Sephardic Jews, and the whole story of Columbus is very interesting because that's also when the Moors were kicked out of Spain. That also led to the collapse of the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire as the western parts of Europe tried to gain power over the Eastern Mediterranean, where the main trade routes were for West Africa. And it is at that time that the commerce of West Africa shifted from towards Turkey and Venice to the coast, because the Portuguese came around the West African coast and they decided they wanted to grow coffee in Brazil, to make a long story very short. And now here we are. So I'm particularly interested in this. I also want to say, I've been in Easton for 8 years. I love Easton. It's really a great town. I think there are a lot of opportunities in this discussion. One of the opportunities is to help people of color, so-called, consider the other kinds of racisms that existed in the United States. And I'm so glad that this dialogue has started in this way, because I was afraid that I was going to offend somebody, because I've read a lot. I was very fascinated at one point on the history of Italian Americans, most of whom came from Southern Italy. So, you know, there's a prejudice that preceded Italians that existed in England. And part of people constructing their white Anglo-Saxon identity was to reject Italians and Catholicism in the name of this history that they thought they were related to. But in addition to that, I think the art world has a lot of opportunities, and that we should look towards museums to see in what way they can contribute to holding on to these histories. To me, it's more a discussion about where these icons should be placed. But I think we can't afford to not have the icons. I think we have to accept these people existed in their complexity, and we should know about it. Frankly, Columbus's brother was 80 times worse than he was. If you know the story, he was responsible for most of the murders in Hispaniola. But Columbus was an entrepreneur who had a contract with the Spanish government. So it's kind of hard to even have this conversation without talking about Spanish imperial designs in America. So I kind of think I see both sides. I do think that we need to signal something about the complexity, not only of who Columbus was, but of American relationships to Columbus, and the struggles, really, that Italian Americans have had to face, just like Lebanese Americans and Syrian Americans, Jewish Americans, serious racist struggles. And those things should not be swept under the rug, I believe. The other thing being,
I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on to the other panelists, but I so look forward to you speaking.
I would look to museums to offer us some suggestions about what we can do with some of these problematic icons.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Wendy. Accidentally muted myself. Chuck DeMund, would you like to go ahead and take the floor?
Yes, Wanishi. Following my culture, following my spirituality, I would like to say that I was taught by elders that everything begins and ends with Creator. Everything begins with His dream and ends with His dream. So as we sit here today through this cyber activity, through the Zoom meeting, and talk about who we are and talk about the discussion of a monument that causes some heartache and grief to others, first thing I'd like to do is say a few opening words of prayer, which is Pihak Quinamin, Ilangandang Wanishi Yukwe Ki Quikteli Mukwe Tamanen Quikwe Lalen Quinganic and Hani Cantanto at Meka Queen Anishi. I say thank you that we come together as a people, as all people, and that Creator smiles upon us, and we open our hearts to each other to understand each other in a better way. As I said earlier, my experience with Columbus and my tribal experience with Columbus is non-existent, because we are Lenape people from this area, from Easton. There's many different treaties that were signed in Easton in the 1750s after the walking purchase, which is in the same aspect of what happened in the Caribbean islands to the Taino people. When Columbus first came to the island now known as San Salvador and the Caribbean islands known as Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and the Virgin Islands, in those areas, if I'm not mistaken. If my geographical issues are bad, please forgive me. The Taino people lived in a special spiritual close to the earth way, and they had no idea the decimation and the genocide that was coming their way. When they greeted Columbus in the ships, they didn't know who he was. They just thought he was another person coming from across the water. They didn't realize that he was on an expedition to basically pillage, enslave, commit genocide, start wars, and really decimate the Taino people. By the 1500s, the Taino people were almost wiped out completely through disease and warfare, which was all perpetrated after Columbus found them. After, I can't say discovered, because you can't discover a people that are already there. So with that being said, we have to take into account the idea of colonization, the idea of the conquest of what we as indigenous people call Turtle Island. We were put here first, but we were pushed aside by Euro-Christian, colonization. We were decimated. We were forced to move. We were forced to be put on reservations to assimilate amongst people if we didn't have to move. And also a lot of different things like disease. We weren't used to the European diseases such as smallpox, diphtheria, all the different things that happened. And we were very susceptible to that. So much of our people were wiped out through disease. And the very remnants of the people within Easton, I believe, that are mostly affected by the Columbus statue would have to be Hispanic people. So you have to look towards your Hispanic community and ask them, you know, much in the same way that we were affected by the Penn brothers and the Walking Purchase Treaty in the 1730s, that we had to, you know, move or assimilate into the woods, basically, but we were drove west. The Taino people, they were driven basically into the mountains, the back mountains of Puerto Rico and other islands, and basically into the sea, or they were persecuted. There was a time period where, in the search and lust for gold, that the Spanish would enslave the Taino people, and if they didn't make their quota for the day, they would chop their hand off, the men of the Taino people. This was told to me by Taino elders, and my first response was, it doesn't make good sense to chop your workers' hands off when you want them to bring you gold, because now they have no hands to go get their gold for you. But this wasn't, there was so many Taino people that they thought they could do this freely. So if anybody of Hispanic descent from the Caribbean islands, from Puerto Rico, from Dominican Republic, from Haiti, if anybody has any historical context of who they are as Taino people and the conquest that happened through Columbus, when they see the statues of Columbus, it has to affect them. There has to be, even if they're not aware of it, subconsciously, there could be a generational ache that goes back to their ancestors. And at this time, like I said earlier, we're sitting here now in council, basically, even though we're going through Zoom and we have a large audience watching us talk, we're sitting here in council. So in council, we have to think of what's good, not for ourselves, but for our grandchildren's grandchildren, for the next 7 generations.
We are going to have to move on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Wanishi.
Thank you, guys. Just a quick reminder to our audience before we move on to Dr. Joseph Scelsa. Feel free to drop any comments, questions that you have so far in the chat box, and we will get to them all during the Q&A. Thank you. Passing it over to you, Doctor.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for conducting this forum. I think it's long overdue and much needed, not only in Easton, but all over the United States. The original sin of America is racism. And unfortunately, Italian Americans experienced it too in this country. Many of you on this panel know that the second most lynched people in America were the Italians. The largest mass lynching that took place in America was in New Orleans in 1891, when 11 Italians were lynched. As a matter of fact, the mayor of New Orleans apologized for that just this last year in an official proclamation. But it's not the only state where the Italians were lynched. Italians were lynched in every state in the United States. Not as many as African Americans, but many. And we understand what it's like. We do. And in some ways, the Columbus statue for us is a reminder of the struggles and the hardships that our ancestors went through when they came to this country, trying to fit in, trying to be part of the larger society. This discussion of race has to take place. I mean, this is an Anglo-Saxon tradition, absolutely. And it really starts with Britain. It doesn't start, it's that's where it came from. But as a result of it, you know, we came later. We didn't come at the beginning of the Americas. We came mostly after 1880 to 1920, the last immigration to America. And there were many hardships. My grandparents came at that time, and it's particularly hard for me when I hear people talk about the symbols that they felt so personally dear to. I know in New York City, where I'm from, you know, the immigrants raised the money, just as they did in Easton, Pennsylvania, to erect the monument of Columbus in Columbus Circle. Fortunately, we were able to save it so far. The mayor of New York had a panel that discussed the monuments in New York City just 2 years ago. And the panel came up with the recommendation that it stayed. And the recommendation also that there be descriptive language around it to describe and to have a conversation. But we're having a conversation amongst ourselves, but this conversation needs to exist. If anything, this horrific situation that's happened in our country, I'm not talking about Columbus, I'm talking about what happened with recently with all the deaths that have taken place and Black Lives Matters, is we need to have this conversation, but we need to be together. We need to look at how we've all suffered, and maybe looking at Columbus helps us to do that as well, because we understand, and if each of us can understand our own history and then share it with others, as we know, obviously on this panel, a lot of people know the history of other groups, you know, but not everybody does. And they need to know that, and they need to understand that their group wasn't the only one that suffered. Many groups suffered, and they picked up their own symbols and their own heroes. Columbus was an American hero, first celebrated in 1792 by the Tammany Society in New York City, when New York City was the capital of the United States. You know, so it's been a long tradition. So in what Italians considered to be the first immigrant, they associated with him and wanted to show everybody that they were good citizens. They weren't bad citizens. I mean, this is I don't know if you can all see this, but this is a picture from in Life magazine in 1909, where the Italians were seen as being thugs, hoodlums, and they were not wanted. I have other ones that are in this book here, WAP, which was written by a good friend of mine, Salvatore Lagumina, and from Nassau County Community College. It has many depictions of Italians as monkeys and as vagrants, and wanting them to go back. But we think these things don't still go on today. This happened just in 1919 in the New York Post, where again, 3 Italians were depicted as mob fellows.
Cuomo.
The governor and the former governor of New York State, and the brother of the current governor. I mean, this is uncalled for in today's society. And it brings up such pain, and I can understand how African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, other groups feel that pain too. And we need to share that and share our experiences and appreciate that each one of us has them. I think these monuments can do that. I think they need to be in a place where they can be revered and respected. And they need to have the context so that people understand what they're all about and why they were put there. And what they mean not only to the group that put them there, what they mean for all of us to share each other's common experience. If we can't come together as a nation, we're gonna fall apart. We need to understand our common experience, our common legacy, our common destiny, why we all wanna be here. in this country, why people are still dying to get here, why they want to come in. I mean, why they're willing to cross thousands of miles across borders to walk across deserts to get into this country. Because this is still a great place. And this is still a place that still holds a beacon to everyone in the world. If we lose that, we tear ourselves apart by fighting amongst ourselves. We're going to lose that, and we're going to lose that immigrant spirit that made this country so great. So I think these statues need to remain. I think they need to have context. I think we need to discuss them, whether it's in a classroom or it's in a museum or it's in some other place of historical significance. In New York City, we had our monument, thanks to the Columbus Citizens Foundation, named to be on the National Historic Registry. Maybe this statue should be on the National Historic Registry with the context attached to it, of where it came from, what it was all about. So people could learn, school children could learn the real history, not the history that they're currently learning in the schools.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you very much. Oh, you're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much.
Before we pass it to Julie Burrows, really quickly, I think Jane is going to hop on to clarify something for us. Thank you.
I just want to thank all the audience members so far who are asking really, really thoughtful questions. I'm hoping that we can get to all of them once we get to the Q&A portion of the panel. But I also just want to remind everybody that the only people who are really going to have an opportunity to speak are the panelists themselves. We simply don't have enough time to let all 120 people who are here start speaking. Otherwise, we'll just run out of time completely. And I am sorry if that offends anybody, but it is the way that we've had to structure this. We are happy to receive your comments in the chat section, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to give anybody an opportunity to speak. So thank you very much. Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much for that, Jean. Alrighty, Julie. You're up next. You're still muted, yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, I have learned so much from our panelists tonight, and it is so clear that this monument and Columbus monuments really hold a lot of different meaning for different people. And I really want to honor that the intention of this monument came from a desire to lift up people and celebrate and validate people who were marginalized. And of course, the list of people who've been erased, marginalized, invalidated, you know, it's a very, very, very long list in this country. And I think with artwork in particular, what's important to understand is, you know, intention is important, but it's different from how things are received and how things are perceived. And I think this really forces us to talk about and really think about the role of public art in our public places, in our towns, in our communities. You know, we have so much healing to do. Not only because of COVID, right, has just laid bare so many of the other fissures and wounds that have not healed in this country. And I am loving this discussion because I would love for us to think about, is there a way to think about the role of public art in helping us as a community to heal and to understand what are the best ways to lift up and commemorate and celebrate those who've been marginalized, those who've been erased from the history books, in Easton in particular, because I really do think this is about this community. And then also in parallel that this discussion happens in so many other communities. And I think that the discussion is so important, and that the role of art to help us gain this kind of understanding, I think is so exciting and full of possibilities, but it does take discussion and not just the unthoughtful destruction of works of art. So that's really my point of view, is to really think about this moment and how can we look to public art to help us to heal and to really move forward in a way that centers what reflects the values of Easton as a city in the year 2020, because it's a different place than it was in 1740, which I think is when Easton was founded. I might be wrong on the exact date, but this town has been around for a long, long time, and it's changed a tremendous amount. And I think discussing what our values are as a city and reflecting those values in public art would be an awesome thing for us to achieve through this dialogue. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Julie. Alrighty, this has all been so informative and so robust, and I thank you all so much for your thoughtful commentary. Moving on to question number 2, we have, excuse me for a moment, in approximately 5 minutes, once again, what do you envision happening with this statue? What would you like to have people understand about its significance and about the significance of that outcome, whether it's historically, personally, professionally, for you and others like you? And once again, Melissa, you can go ahead and speak first. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, this is a huge opportunity for our community to come together. I think most of my life growing up in Easton, you heard the P word, which is Easton had a lot of potential, right? And now we're at this precipice where Easton is kind of getting there. You know, it's not gentrified. It has unique character and people and murals and artists. And yet there's this Columbus statue there, which is just a drag. And we have to ask ourselves, how many Columbus statues do we need? And what does this mean for Easton, right? Because I think a lot of people who now know that there's a Columbus monument there are very confused by it. And if they're watching right now, they're getting education on who he was and what his significance was to the Italian American communities, and specific to Easton too, because there's a large entire riverfront along the Easton Delaware River and Lehigh River that was largely populated by Italian Americans. And through my petition that was shared on Facebook, the Easton Facebook page, I had a lot of hate and retaliation by people and a lot of anger in response to that, not only from Italian Americans, but also the Lebanese community and other communities too, because they were displaced specifically in Easton, Pennsylvania. And so there's a lot of unpacked trauma there. People don't have the emotional intelligence or vocabulary to really express what they're feeling because people don't talk about it. You just hear hate. And so when I saw that on the Facebook page, I saw pain, I saw hurt, and that has to be healed within Easton. And art is such a great opportunity. I personally would love to see the statue whitewashed with glitter on it, with mirrors at the bottom, so people can see themselves in this beautiful reflection of who they are. And its ears chopped off and nose chopped off, just like Christopher Columbus did to Native Americans. But we really need to interpret and realize that this statue is not creating safe spaces within our public spaces. It does not match the personality in Easton, Pennsylvania. It doesn't. And as an Italian American, we really have to question what this monument means to us today. We have to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, trans Black Lives Matter, Indigenous people, to really come to terms with our history, because whose history is it? Is it white history? Is it our history? Is it our children's? We need to understand what we're learning and what we're teaching in order to make this this place, our city, a safer space for everybody. Healing, empathy is a huge opportunity. Art, because mental health is anti-racism work. When you really know yourself, you have integrity, you can help others and show up and stand up for everybody. And that's what I see in Easton. And if the city council, if the mayor doesn't agree, they're going to be left behind. I truly believe that, because if you participated in the protests, they're happy and positive and energetic, and people really want to see that in their communities. And it's a beautiful thing. And this monument needs to come down. It needs to be reinterpreted. It needs to have an unlearning and a relearning happening, because there are a lot of other racist monuments around us. Our healthcare system, our prison system, our education system, those monuments are the toughest monuments to take down. The Christopher Columbus monument is a lot easier to take down. So I just urge everybody to do a lot of reflection, get involved. There's a lot of great opportunities to join organizations such as Power Lehigh Valley, Stand Up Lehigh Valley, your local NAACP chapter. Just donate, participate, speak with your friends and families, coworkers, to create safer spaces for everybody. Regardless of your pain, use your pain to learn more about yourself and your surroundings. Use it, because it's a huge opportunity for growth. And Easton is going to do really, really good things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Wendy, what would you like to see happen with the statue? Oh, you're still muted.
First, I want to thank Melissa for her passionate discussion, which was really engaging. And it made me think maybe we need to have like 10 Columbuses. What if you had the original Columbus statue, and then you had 4 on each side from other perspectives? That would be such a 21st century artistic experience and statement. That's what I meant by opportunity. I think it would really engage people in what we're talking about, trying to think about what the histories are of these different icons. So maybe we should have 5 Columbus statues, or maybe we should have a small museum in which the statue resides. But I'm all for public education. I'm all for recognizing how different histories look different. The same history looks different depending on your positionality. And that's something, as a democratic society that's multi-ethnic, we just have to face. As everyone here is saying, we can't keep, there's no more room under the rug. And so I think if we're going to respond to this question of pain and trauma and healing, however one-sided my own little opinion might be, I think it's really important to treat all of these things as an opportunity. And actually, I'm very excited about the idea of having really some kind of public discourse about Columbus. It would be one of the first times Americans actually go back to thinking about themselves as the result of imperial exploration and conquest. So we could join the rest of our hemisphere again. So I'm all for some really imaginative, creative discussion. Changing it for sure. We have to do something new, but let's not throw the baby with the bathwater.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Chuck, how about you? What would you like to see happen with the statue?
Okay, had to unmute myself. In order to speak about this, I've been thinking that I should bring up another monument that I had participated in the removal of in the late 1990s up in Milford, Pennsylvania, just a few miles upriver from Easton, along our river, Lenape. And it was to Tom Quick Jr. And the legend of it was that Tom Quick Jr. killed 99 Lenape people before he died in retaliation of our people killing his father. And it was a very one-sided racist representation of a local folk hero. And when it got knocked down on the history of Wounded Knee, on the anniversary of Wounded Knee, immediately the town tried to rebuild it. They attempted to put it back up. And our people, many of the different Lenape groups came together and stood opposed to it because it was representing a form of genocide, a form of basically wiping out our people in that area because of things that have happened that required our removal, and we wanted to stay in our homeland. So that being said, with the Columbus statue, that also represents a part of genocide for indigenous people, the beginning of colonization, the beginning of removal and assimilation, the beginning of many different horrors, disease, warfare, all those different things. And to say hypothetically to put up 5 different Columbus statues to the people that were oppressed by the conqueror, and I'm not talking about an Italian American, or I'm not talking about any specific race. I'm talking about the conquest from basically the Spanish government that put him in charge to come and find gold and find minerals and find anything that he could in the Americas. And it caused much bloodshed, it caused disease, it caused many, many tears for Taino people, to the fact now that many people consider Taino people to be extinct. And they're not. They're trying to celebrate their culture. But with the Columbus statue opposing that, saying that, I mean, what are we taught in school? We're taught that the Taino people don't exist. We're not taught anything about them. We're taught that Columbus discovered America. He sailed the ocean blue, discovered America, and he wasn't even on the mainland. He never set foot on the mainland. So the whole history of it is a misconception taught to our children. So when we're at home and trying to teach our children a different way from what our educational system is teaching it, it becomes a conflict for many of our children at a very young age, indigenous children especially, that when they go to school, they're persecuted because of many different issues, not just the Columbus statue. But you have to understand, right now, just recently, the mascot issue has started coming back to the forefront. The Washington Redskins changing their name, all these different things that have happened. This is all part of that genocidal ache within indigenous people. It's all part of the oppression that has happened over generations for our people. So to say that, Columbus could be a teaching tool, yes, he could. But where are most things taught? In museums. They're not built as monuments to honor someone that brought genocide and horrific conditions to another people. So that, as part of our personal tribe's prophecy of the fourth crow, that's why I accepted this invitation to come here and speak, because we have to be able to come out of hiding and speak to people about what the feeling is behind these monuments, behind the glorification of someone that came in and did some evil things to another people. And yes, there was evils done to the people that brought those monuments forward. Absolutely. We are far from a perfect country, very far. But we could walk a little bit closer by helping to educate in a better way the meaning behind these monuments and the meaning to all people behind the monuments, including indigenous people. So a museum place would probably be the best, in my opinion.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it. Moving on to Dr. Shelsa. I'm afraid you're still muted, yes.
Yep. Okay.
There you go.
Well, thank you very much again for conducting this forum. I think it's long overdue. It really needs to happen. I'd just like to say that, besides the Italian American issue and Catholicism, one of the seminal moments that took place in the world was bringing two hemispheres together. And regardless of whether or not Leif Erikson ever came to the Americas, Columbus's voyages opened up for the Europeans the two continents of North America and South America, which had not been opened up before at that time. And for whatever happened, both the good and the bad, it took place as a result of that. We wouldn't have the United States of America today, I don't believe, if that would have happened. So I think we need to remember that too in the context of history. I mean, he was an incredible sailor. Yeah, he had his numbers wrong in terms of going to the Orient, but he was to anybody who's seen with the replicas of those ships, who's been on them, I have. I mean, I wouldn't travel across the ocean in it. I mean, I'd be scared to death to go into a lake with it. I mean, forget about an ocean. To go across the Atlantic Ocean in one of those ships is just amazing. Yes, I think some of the atrocities that took place need to be relooked at and need to be studied, and they need to be shared so people understand the negative things that happened. But we got to look at some of the positive things that happened. You know, when you talk about disease, that the Europeans brought disease, I beg, you know, and I don't want to do this like back and forth, but like disease was brought the other way too. Syphilis did not exist in Europe before Columbus's voyages. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, slavery existed in both North America and South America before Columbus's voyages came to America. Blood sacrifices existed, you know, in the Americas, and Columbus didn't bring that here. Yeah, I mean, some of the cruelty that 15th century conquerors used to control people would never be condoned and should not be condoned then or now. But that's not the significance of this voyage. The significance of this voyage is none of us talking today, whether we came on top of the ship or the bottom of the ship, our ancestors, would be in this country today if it wasn't for those voyages. Except, of course, for Chuck, who obviously was here before, whose ancestors walked across the landmass from Europe. He's probably got more Asian DNA in him than anything else. But that's the significance of it. What I'd like to see happen is I'd like to see more conversations like this, whether they take place in museums or they take place in classrooms. Unfortunately, a lot of what's going on in the classrooms today is just one-sided and not true. It's just not true. Columbus never enslaved anybody, and he never killed anybody. Some of the Spanish conquistadors did, and that's true. He did want to San Salvador. He did want to bring Christianity to the North America and South America, and that was part of his mission. And of course, you know, that have its ramifications as well. But I think we need to look at it all, and we also need to look at it in the context of a 15th century explorer, as opposed to a 21st century, you know, values that we have today, and understand it and study it, and understand that yes, some of the things that happened were wrong, but we need to grow from that and not just tear it apart. And that's what I think we need to do, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in a museum, or whether it's in a public space where art is found, where we can have this dialogue. And that's important. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, finally, moving it over to Julie Burrows, and then we'll open it up for questions.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that something Melissa mentioned earlier about when she first thought about the statue, she thought it was George Washington overlooking the Delaware. And that really illustrated a point that I wanted to make about permanent monuments in public space and how they do tend, as fixed objects, often tend to recede into the background to the point where they become invisible, which I think is a huge problem with our approach to public art. And I would say that I can see arguments for not destroying this artwork, but moving it to another place. I can also see arguments that can be made where this piece and this monument is irrelevant to Easton today, because Italian Americans, I don't think, are still a marginalized people, nor are Catholics, but that we can debate that. That's a different argument, I think. What I would really want to argue for is an approach to public art in this city that is not about permanent art that will recede into the background and become irrelevant in 2 year, 5 year, 100 years time. What I would rather see Easton do is take a proactive approach to public art based on a dialogue about what reflects the values of our city today, and have temporary public art. You know, 2020 is the centennial of women's suffragette, women getting the vote. Hopefully I didn't get that wrong. Was it last year? Is it this year? Is it next year? The thing is, I would love to see us celebrate that as a town and embrace that as a woman. I think it's amazing. And what if we thought about public art and thought about what is it today that we want to celebrate, lift up, interpret, heal, discuss, commemorate, and that public art is temporary. You know, these murals on the streets for Black Lives Matter, painting on the street doesn't last, it's temporary. But it is expressing right now, this moment. So I'd love for us to take this dialogue far beyond sort of litigating the sins or not and the accomplishments of Columbus, and really talk about public art. What's the role of public art? You know, the Columbus Monument probably accomplished what it was intended to do a long time ago, and it has somehow receded into the background and maybe is not that relevant for Easton today. And how can we think about public art as a way to heal, lift up, celebrate, commemorate, and really reflect where we want to go as a city into the future? And so that's really what I feel is an exciting discussion to have in Easton right now.
Thank you so much for that, Julie, and to all of our panelists once again for your candid conversation. Before we open it up to our audience Q&A, I know that there are already some questions from panelists for other panelists, and Wendy, I do see your hand up, so if you want to go ahead and ask away.
I really appreciated two things quickly. One is that in terms of diseases, we have history has been interpreted in very romantic ways. The truth of the matter is there was so much trade between Africa and Europe that they shared the same diseases. It's not because Africans were stronger or anything like that. They shared the same diseases because there was so much trade from the time of the Romans between the two continents. In the Americas, those diseases did not get here. They came with the Europeans. They had not had the same contact with Europeans that Africa had. And while the second thing is, I really appreciate the statement that was just made about museums, but I do believe that we have some dreams that are colliding here in Easton. And I do think that the symbolic importance of the Columbus statue or other statues is because those issues are still alive in Easton. I mean, I've only been here for 8 years, but I don't see everybody being happy with making a big change and then just talking about voting. I think people have an emotional attachment to these discussions, and I think that together we can come to some other kinds of options. Thank you so much for letting me say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Other panelists, do you have questions for each other before we open it up to the audience Q&A? Comments are welcome as well. In that case, Jean, have you seen any compelling questions come through at this point?
I have, if you look, hopefully you're getting these in the chat section. Are they coming through for you?
I haven't seen the ones that you have sent me at this point. Why don't you take it away and I'll try to hunt them down.
Yeah, let me start with this. one of the guests, Ariel, has been asking, and she said, we keep talking about the monument as art, but it's also a symbol. I think that we need to ask, what does it symbolize today? And how does that symbol set a tone for what Easton symbolizes? And she didn't direct that to anyone specifically. So any of the panelists, if you'd like to comment, that would be great.
All right, I see Chuck raising his hand. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to speak on that as a symbol, okay? Easton is steeped in a history for our people through our people being there along the Lehigh and Delaware River. And during the 1730s, the time of the walking purchase by the Penn brothers that stole a lot of land from us and forced us to be removed, you have to look at the symbolism of a statue in which it began with the decimation of a tribe. So for us, for tribal people, for all nations of people, we all have our individual stories of removal. We have our individual stories of reservations. We have individual stories of assimilation and heritage. And it's all affected by the beginning of the Columbus Monument. I'm not trying to take anything away from Italian Americans. I'm not trying to take anything away from any other Americans. But you have to remember that First Nations Americans have had everything taken away from them. So a little bit of the healing process would be to start recognizing that and removing some of those historical monuments that bring forth the oppression of a people at the benefit of another people. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. I don't mean to offend anybody. I'm just trying to educate what it is when it comes to our people, how the feeling is, and that would include Taino people. Wanishi.
Joseph, would you like to respond? I think you're still muted. Joseph, I'm sorry, I muted again.
What I think what I would like to see is representations not only of historical pieces, which I think this is, and it has a place in history. And I think the context of what it was put up, it is important that people learn about that history as well. But I think it's also important that other monuments or other public art be put up today, contemporary art, not just temporary art, but permanent, more permanent art, not just street paintings, but also, monuments or statues or parks, something that also can also instill people to want to have a conversation about what it's all about today. That's what I'd like to see. Maybe I'd like to see a place, when you talk about museums, it has to be a very special museum to be able to do that. I don't believe it should be relegated to an Italian American museum. I don't, and I'm the president of an Italian American museum. All right. I think in order to have this dialogue, we need to be in a place where we have many, many different voices being heard. And I want to continue that. But to drown out or to take out one voice, you're going to alienate a whole population, just as you were alienated before. And that's not right either. So I'm not saying, and two wrongs don't make a right. We all know that. And we learned that as children. So I'm saying that we need a place, a forum. Maybe these are the forums. Maybe the forums just as you've put together today is the way to do it. And I think this is, actually. So this dialogue is very healthy. And we need to come to terms with that. We need to share each other's experiences and learn more about each other's experiences and what they mean. And also respect each other's experiences, for what they were and what they are in each and every one of us. That's the way I see it. Maybe it's a utopia, but that's the utopia that I'd like to see. Thank you
so much for that, Joseph. We really appreciate it. We have another question that has come in from Jocelyn. It is posed to the panel. And she says, it seems like the mutual compromise is to remove colonial and Confederate monuments and move them into museum or museum-type educational and preservation centers. But who should pay for this? Should modern descendants of the people oppressed by many of the people these monuments be forced to pay for these processes via their tax dollars? For example, many of these monuments were erected by private dollars, but on public land. Wendy, would you like to speak to that? I'm sorry, I think I accidentally muted you. That was on me.
There is the idea of the public good. And the public good is not constituted by people just getting something that directly benefits them. So with the concept of the public good, which has gotten rather lost over the last decade or so, people would ideally work together to create such an educational center because it's good for the space that we share, which is Easton. To go forward something like this, we all have to have a concept of the public good. And I would just like to say we really need to include the Lenape people and the hundreds of Hispanics who live here, who are not even here with us visibly this evening, in such a common endeavor.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? I know, Julie, you and I have had some, oh, I'm sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, I think having a question of where is this funding coming from, and because this is privately funded, I think that would be a great opportunity for people to personally and individually invest in their future and what their public arts spaces look like, specifically because crowdsourcing funding has been increasingly easier with technology. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who would gladly put forth $500 towards the removal of this. And I just also want to say that museums, although it's a great idea to relocate monuments into a museum, I think we also have to come to terms with the fact that museums are also historically racist. They lack diversity. They really have to understand the gaze in which and whose history they're looking at, and to be sure that there's an inclusion of history there and diversity in thought. Specifically, when our mayor and our town council have been pretty silent on this matter too, the people pretty much are very vocal about this. They want their individual opinion to be heard, and I think that's amazing. People should speak up more, specifically from a monetary standpoint, but then also in the decision made. But we really need to make sure that just because it's going into a museum or wherever it's going, we really need to make sure that this is an active anti-racism.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Julie, did you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, I think that the question brings up an issue for Easton in particular, and that is, it's probably the worst possible time to be asking this, because I know that municipal revenues have been severely impacted by the closure of businesses and the parking revenue, and it's a long list, but we can talk about it. We can talk about how does the city of Easton fund the arts. We're lucky that we've got a lot of wonderful advocates and volunteers and organizations and some institutions that plan events, and you know, we are a very creative city, and yet I don't know that city government is actually putting much funding into the arts or officially public art. So this could be the time to think about how in the future, when revenues are a little bit better, the city might want to deliberately carve out some funding for whether it's the care of existing public art, the relocation, deaccessioning, commissioning new art, whether it's permanent or temporary. I think that a city like Easton that has the reputation of being artsy and creative and beautiful and artistic should actually think about putting some money into it in an official, systematic way, whether it's a percent for art or a trust or philanthropy or or even if it's you know, a public art fund where we raise money for it, I think it's a great time to have that discussion about government funding for public art in Easton.
Thank you so much, Julie. We did just have another question come in from Frank Lorenzo, and he asks, would it be a civil rights violation to remove an Italian-American cultural symbol? Would this be a discriminatory act?
Possibly.
I see Joseph raising his hand as well. You'll have to unmute yourself first.
It's not a discussion that I really wanted to get into, but I will get into it. Italian Americans are considered a cognizable racial group in the United States of America. We have civil rights, and there is a question as to whether or not the removal of a symbol that is a part of another group, because it's part of speech, and in removing speech, you're actually discriminating against the group. There's a civil rights question here. I said in the beginning that I fought a civil rights suit in 1992. And some of you who are students of civil rights will know the name Constance Baker Motley. She was a preeminent jurist on the Southern District of New York and had carried the papers for Thurgood Marshall for the Brown decision. She said that Italian Americans are a cognizable racial group, which means that we have the same rights and privileges as any other racial group in the United States, and therefore the same protections. Yes, it is a civil rights issue. That's my opinion. It should, and I'm sure that in a court of law, it would be proven to be so.
Thank you for that. Would anyone like to respond? Julie?
Julie? Did she hear you?
Yeah, I think you're still muted. Oh no.
Got it. I kept saying I couldn't unmute myself. So there is also an artist rights issue, and this is why it's important to create an actual official, you know, ownership has to be established, artist rights need to be followed. Whoever the descendants of the artist are, it is actually very complicated to properly remove any piece of artwork. This is something we dealt with in Boston. So there is a proper process that should be followed, and if it doesn't exist, then the city of Easton or whoever actually owns the piece needs to follow a proper process, whether it's recontextualizing, adding interpretation, adding artwork around it, removing it, repositioning it. It all has legal repercussions, and think that now is the time to figure out what is the right process for any action to be taken on the piece, but it gets complicated pretty quickly.
Thank you for clarifying. Here is another question that's come up by a couple of different people. Is Columbus the best possible representation of Italian American heritage? Are there others who might be less controversial at this point? Chuck, I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I would like to ask that question to the gentleman who was representing the Italian Americans. It's my impression that the Lenape people were very much affected in a good way by Verrazano. Can he speak to that on Verrazano coming up the river through Manhattan and that area? I believe that I have been taught that he was an explorer that had a very good relationship with indigenous First Nations people. Not in comparison to Columbus. I would just like to bring that up and see what he thinks about it.
Interesting.
Chuck, yeah, you're right. Verrazano did have a good relationship, and he was the first one before Henry Hudson to sail up the Hudson River. And we have a bridge named after him in New York City that goes from Staten Island to Brooklyn. It's which was quite an undertaking. A man by the name of John LaCorte, who is the president of the Italian Historical Society before he passed away, in Brooklyn, was really the person who was responsible for that. And naming some other famous Italian Americans like Bonaparte, who predated the FBI with a Secret Service and in Washington at a monument. He did a lot of good things. He also discovered that the first Italian to arrive in New York was with the Dutch East India Company in 1635. Pietro Cesare Alberti did a lot of things like that. There were a lot of famous Italians. I didn't choose Columbus. My grandfather chose Columbus. I'm not going to argue with my grandfather. You know, that's what it really comes down to. You know, like, how do you tell? You know, that's who they chose. That's our symbol. That's what I grew up with. That's the reason for it. You know, there are definitely a plethora of people out there that are qualified to be recognized, I'm sure. And what I would like to see, and why doesn't somebody raise the money for a statue for the indigenous people in your area? Why don't you do that? I mean, and I would see a monument being next to or not too far away, so you can have this discussion back and forth. I mean, I would contribute money to that. You know, I think that's the type of thing that you need. Anyway, that's the answer to that. Thank you. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you. Chuck, I thought I saw a hand go up. Did you want to respond?
Yes, I just wanted to mention I would not fight with my grandfather either. So.
We have time for just about one, maybe two questions. Here is one that I think is somewhat related to what we just heard as well. So, is a monument the most effective way to share a people's struggle or commemorate an event?
I'll say so.
Would anyone else like to respond? Or
Andrea Smith, if you're still on, would you be at all interested in addressing that question?
Good.
Okay.
It looks like Melissa might want to respond as well. I'm sorry, Andrea, I accidentally muted you again.
Does Andrea want to go? Oh wait. Okay.
I could speak, or you can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I've been doing research on a different set of monuments, and I've been talking about this with Seneca people in New York State who, you know, had a whole discussion about what would you do if you wanted to commemorate Seneca history. And this one man said to me, well, he wouldn't put up a monument, he would do something different. And one of the things he was talking about was just simply changing place names, putting Seneca language words on as street names, place names, and start to change things that way. The other thing is just to create a cultural center about a community of people that presents the world from their perspective. So a monument is kind of a simple way. It's a very traditional, it's a very formal American way of summarizing the past, but we've got developed this kind of conventional system, and so we just kind of follow it by convention, but there's so many other things you could do. So
Thank you for that, Andrea. Melissa, did you have your hand up to respond to this as well? Go for it.
I think it's a good question to ask why we have so many monuments in the first place. And I know that a lot of them were erected around the same several decades. I think the 1920s and 30s, when people were trying to establish themselves, specifically after the Reconstruction movement from post-Civil War and KKK, where they were erecting monuments all around the South, and it kind of forced other people to. So why do we need a monument to serve as this deity, as protection? And quite frankly, art is something that is great, and it will continue to change. And so if we say that this statue is a piece of art, its context is changing. Nothing's permanent, everything changes. There are monuments that people just leave to go, like Mother Nature takes over, for instance. They stop tending to them. So the reality is that a lot of these monuments, specific Columbus monuments, are very cheaply made, cheap metal. And so it wouldn't take much for Mother Nature to take over. And that's something that some cities are choosing to do. We really have to understand why we have monuments, why we need monuments. And I have to be honest, we can't depend on our public education to do that. I think historically, public education has been taught what to teach for decades, specific from a very few select group of people who have associations with white supremacist groups in this country. And so now people are starting to get it, they're starting to catch up. But I don't know if any of you have actually stood beneath this Christopher Columbus monument in Easton. And it says it right on the monument. This statue is for Italian American immigrants and all immigrants. And yet we don't know that. And so as a monument, as an art piece, how it interacts with public spaces, it seems like there needs to be a real statement made by the city here, because this is a huge opportunity to speak directly to the people and create safe spaces. Because Columbus is the wrong mascot, man. They chose the wrong mascot.
Can I say something?
Absolutely, please.
Okay, I just, the thing is, we have place names, street names that are also monuments. They serve as monuments for various people and various figures in our town's past. And for instance, we have a trail named after a military general, Sullivan Trail. We travel on that every day. The Sullivan expedition was a genocidal expedition against the Iroquois.
Yes, it was.
So, yeah, and so we live in this landscape that's just permeated with commemorations of various people, and maybe we have to critically examine all of them, and not, so we're commemorating all sorts of histories in ways that people sometimes don't realize, just by driving down a road and keeping the same conventional names on the street, on the maps. So.
Thank you. Joseph, did you want to respond? You'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to say that this is how I got involved with creating an Italian American museum. And I think this is a lesson for all of you, and those are the activists that are out there. How does a museum even get started? Well, it gets started with the idea that your history isn't being taught in a historical museum in the way that you feel it should be taught, or there isn't enough of it being taught. One would say, well, it's taught in the schools. Not really. And all of you know that because the particular histories that you have, whether it's Native Americans or it's African Americans or it's Hispanics or whatever, it's not being taught. And that's why you need museums to give context, and not only context, but also give detail and also to give study. We're a group of other people who created the Italian American Museum in New York City for that purpose. And I know that I studied, came late into life into it, but I studied the movement of museums, and I also studied the African American museums that were around, and the Jewish museums are around, and El Barrio was in New York City. I went to learn how they went about doing it and why they did it, and then formulated how with my community how we should do it. But it really is what's necessary. Everyone needs a voice, and that's what really needs to happen. There's enough of that out there. And I know that it's a great way to teach young people, because the largest group of people, as those of you who operate museums know, the largest number of people that come are from school groups. And it's the greatest way, and they love to come to museums because they get to actually sometimes touch and feel things, but also see things that they hadn't seen before. So I encourage everyone to consider for their own culture and sharing with everybody's culture, creating these spaces, whether it's within an existing museum or it's a new museum. But I think, some of these small museums are just fantastic. So that's my pitch about museums and why I'm in love with them today. And I think that is a way in which we can all share our culture. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. And I feel like that's a really good stopping place for the questions. I wanted to give everyone the opportunity to put in final responses, comments, to wrap up your arguments, and then we can close up. Would anyone like to chime in first? Julie, go ahead.
Hey, maybe there's a role for the Siegel Museum to play in helping lift up. And I don't remember all the exhibits. I've definitely been there, and there is a lot about the history of Easton for sure. And maybe there's a way for us to look at how Easton changing over time can be interpreted through the lens of today a little bit. So it would be exciting to see how that could play out as a result of this conversation.
I just say,
Andrea, go ahead.
I just want to say, people should go check out the Siegel Museum. They've done a lot recently to renovate the collections and to bring it more up to date.
Amen.
So just a shout out to go check it out.
I agree.
Yeah, I'd
It's
like
a very
to
good
also-
museum.
Yeah, I'd like to compliment the organizers because this has been a great panel, great questions, and it's really very stimulating. I wish there was a way that we could follow up. I wish we could also talk about how we can support the Siegel Museum more, so it can have longer hours, be open more days. I just feel like this is a conversation that needs to keep going.
Thank you so much for saying that. It really means a lot.
I agree. The Siegel Museum has done a lot to help our people and to help the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania stay represented within the city of Easton. And we're very grateful to that. And I'm also very grateful that I came on here to this panel with the idea of a discussion for education of my people. And in doing so, I've learned a lot about other people. So I appreciate that. That circle continues and we keep walking that circle. So thank you. Wanishi. I'm grateful. Thank you.
I just want to say that I've also feel like I learned something today as well. But I can't wait to come back to Easton. I haven't been at the Siegel Museum, but as soon as this COVID virus allows me to, I'm going to make my way out there and visit your museum. And I hope you'll come and visit our museum in New York, all of you. You know, when this is over and you can all travel again.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Claudia, I'll just jump in very quickly, and I just want to thank everybody for the very kind words for our society and for our museum. We are always looking for help from people. If you're ever interested in coming, we're going to have revised hours now that the pandemic has slowed down, and well, now that we are allowed to reopen, we're going to have reduced hours. You can check out our website. We'll have a lot there moving forward in terms of what you can expect when you come in and how all of that will work. And we're also always looking for members to join our organization. We're a nonprofit, and that's how we're run. So please visit our website and take a look.
Thank you, Phoebe. And with that, we are just about at our time today. Before we all sign off, I just want to bring this back to the intentions that started this conversation. We have been so privileged to hear the varied and measured viewpoints from our 5 brilliant panelists. And so this leaves us with the question of what next? And that is in the hands of you, our audience, and members of this great community of ours. We'll be posting this recording on the event page for our conversation today. We'll also be bringing into the Lehigh Valley Facebook groups. We encourage you to keep sharing your thoughts and the takeaways from what you've heard today. And when things inevitably get heated again, just to remember that you're engaging your neighbors and your peers. Our lives are varied and rich with deep-seated opinions, so let's honor those differences and make room for nuance and compassion in the arguments that we hold. To our wonderful panelists, Jean and I are so deeply grateful for your time and your vulnerability. It was really, really, really remarkable to hear from all of you. And to our audience members, thank you so much for opening yourselves up to the different ideas that were presented today. We hope that you enjoyed this robust exchange. And with that, wishing everyone health, well-being, and bits of joy when you can find it during these fraught times. Thank you all so much.
Ciao.
Ciao. Take care, everyone.
The Peach Caneva.
Thank you.